US President Donald Trump says he is not seeking negotiations with Iran, but unconditional surrender. The last time an Iranian regime fell in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the unrest triggered a global oil crisis. People around the world formed long queues at petrol stations and then paid through the teeth when it was their turn. The conflict in the Middle East is sending shockwaves through global energy markets. Oil prices are already soaring. So we want to ask, could the world be facing a new oil crisis? I'm going to be talking about that with Kenneth Medlock, Senior Director at the Centre for Energy Studies in the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be with you shortly. But first, let's take a look at why this part of the world is so crucial for the world's oil supply. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and serves as the main export route for major oil producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE and Iran. Now, normally about 20% of the world's oil, or roughly 20 million barrels, pass through the strait every day. Because the channel is so narrow and difficult to bypass, any disruption there can quickly drive up global oil prices and threaten energy supplies worldwide. Now let's take a look at this time lapse and look at the activity of ships navigating the strait before the war. Then the fighting started, and with every hour, with every day, a dwindling number of vessels actually made the dangerous journey. Now traffic has all but dried up on this once busy shipping lane. And since Monday, only 9 commercial ships have actually made it through the strait. The result of that is that crude oil prices have been surging. And that means that gasoline prices have shot up, pushing up prices for companies, making travelling more expensive and having a run-on effect on the rest of the economy, creating inflationary pressure. So those gas prices are the highest point in Trump's second term. Does the president have a plan to help US motorists? When asked about the higher prices at the pump, he said, quote, "I don't have any concern about it. They'll drop very rapidly when this is over, and if they rise, they rise. But this is far more important than having gasoline prices go up a little bit." All right, well, let's bring in Kenneth Medlock, who's been patiently waiting, Senior Director at the Centre for Energy Studies, Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Great to have you on the show, Kenneth.
Great to be with you.
All right, so I'm just going to quote again what Donald Trump said. He said, "They'll drop very rapidly," referring to the prices, "when this is over, and if they rise, they rise. But this is far more important than having gasoline prices go up a little bit." What's your take on Donald Trump's statement?
I think he's trying to reframe the discussion about the increase in oil prices as a very short run or temporary transitory shock. Namely, not to worry. It's another way to sort of think about it, because once this is over, prices will drop. He's not entirely wrong on that front, but the pain at the pump is a very real issue, particularly in the United States in an election year. So this is something that will ultimately have to be reconciled when we move forward, particularly if it drags on for an extended period, because, you know, as most people know, affordability has been a key issue in the political cycle this year and the end of last year. And the last thing I think that this administration wants to see happen is for it to linger well into this year so that it actually has an impact at the polls when we sort of get to November. So there will be an emphasis along with this to try to end things very quickly. We'll see how effective that is, but without a doubt, consumers care. And I think the administration understands that. So it's a sort of I would argue, a way for Trump to say, "Don't worry, this will pass."
All right. Are you worried?
Of course. I'm a consumer as well. So when price of gasoline goes up, a lot of us are limited in terms of demand responsiveness. You know, we have a certain amount of miles we drive every day to get to and from work. get the kids to school, to all their activities. So those are things that are really inflexible. So when the price at the pump goes up, we all feel it in our pocketbooks.
Kenneth, are we facing an oil crisis?
I don't think it's fair to say we're quite to that level yet, because we still are in the middle of the conflict. I think if we can get to a point where the conflict subsides, it really then becomes an issue of how rapidly can shipments of oil and natural gas out of the region resume. And I want to be clear that when it comes to oil and it comes to natural gas, they're very different commodities. On the oil front, it is highly likely that they could resume very quickly, largely because you would see shipments move out of tankers that are full and basically parked, waiting to move. And then tankers that move into the Persian Gulf would refill quickly from storage. Even if you've got production shut in, that gives you time to restart that production and actually get that supply chain moving in a fluid way. The natural gas cycle is a little bit different. When we talk about LNG in particular, which of course Qatar is a very important contributor to the global supply chain, because of the force majeure that was declared, because Qatar Energy has actually ceased operation at Ras Laffan, restarting an LNG liquefaction facility takes time. So even if the strait were to reopen tomorrow, you're still talking about an extended period where natural gas is going to be in short supply in the global market. And that, of course, doesn't really impact gasoline prices, but it certainly has implications for industrial activity, has implications for the electric power sector and power prices. So again, you're talking about a very real pocketbook issue for consumers and for industrial customers as well. On the oil front, just to be very clear, things can turn around very quickly as long as infrastructure is not damaged in the conflict. And I think it's quite interesting to note that Iranian attacks have been targeting refinery infrastructure. For example, Ras Tanura has been targeted in Saudi Arabia. But when you look at what, at least to date, U.S. and Israeli munitions have actually targeted, it's not Iranian energy infrastructure. And I think that's because there is a cognizant thought that is going into how this plays out going forward. Namely, if there is regime change or there is a settlement reached where peace is ultimately broached, the Iranian economy is going to be heavily dependent on the ability to move oil and petroleum products and longer term, even natural gas. But damaging that infrastructure would really impede the ability of the country to recover. So I think you've seen a very explicit avoidance of energy infrastructure on the part of U.S. and Israel.
I think one of the big, I suppose, areas that I found quite surprising is that, you know, the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. Are there other ways of getting that oil or gas out of the region?
There are other pathways to move crude oil, not really natural gas, but crude oil certainly, but they're limited. So you generally have the ability to move crude oil via pipeline across the Arabian Peninsula and out through the Red Sea. And the Saudis have already been exercising that option. You also have the ability to move UAE crude oil via pipeline sort of around the Strait of Hormuz on a land base and load in the Gulf of Oman and move that out. But combined, the estimate of that total capacity is about 6.5 million barrels a day, which is far cry from the 20 million that you already noted typically traverses the strait. So even with that, you still have a severe supply shortage. And that then pushes the world into a situation where you're relying on either other supplies that can flex, which are limited, but that raises another interesting point with regard to how Russian oil supplies will be treated going forward, as well as inventories. And you have strategic stocks, in IEA member countries, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States, and then inventories that have been built quite robustly in China that could potentially weather the storm, so to speak, for a short period of time. So there is flex in the system to deal with this, but in order to leverage that, you have to see price increase, and that's effectively what we're seeing happen right now.
Yeah, I was going to start first with the impact this could have on, say, those oil and gas producing countries. Tell us about that.
So in the Persian Gulf, we have to understand that oil exports and LNG exports for the countries that are participating in those markets are really the lifeblood of the economic systems there. And so when you disrupt the ability to export, you have a really distinct negative impact on the overall revenue generating capacity of those countries and hence those countries' GDP. Now, it's important to point out that exports of oil and natural gas don't just provide profits for the national oil companies. They also provide revenue that the governments use to support various social programs, infrastructure programs, economic development programs, education, healthcare, a variety of things. And so when you begin to disrupt that for an extended period, it begins to have potentially devastating impacts on those economies. So the quicker this is resolved, the better for all of those countries in the region, so that lifeblood can begin to flow again.
Now, you've already touched on it there before, the importance of course, gasoline and oil for all of us across the world. But is it just energy prices that are going to rise, or are we going to see a knock-on effect, say, for example, in the price of food or other prices as well?
It's a very good question. Energy is a basic input to all economic activity. So this is where you get anything that has to move logistically, on ships, over land and trucks. You have an energy input. There's an energy component to it. So generally what you'll see, if energy prices rise and stay high, that will begin to matriculate through to the price of multiple consumer goods that rely on energy to move those goods around. So it's not instant. That's a very important point, but certainly it can, if sustained, begin to impact the price of consumer goods like food, fruits and vegetables, breadstuffs. I mean, all these things ultimately get impacted because energy is a critical input into moving those to the shelves that we go purchase them from when we go to the grocery store. So absolutely, as it has an impact, but it's not instantaneous. It's an impact that matriculates over time in the case of a sustained increase in the price of energy. Short-term movements in price, as long as they are very short-term and ultimately transitory, don't have a sustained impact in the price on all those other goods.
But let's talk actually about, human nature, which is when there's a situation like this. I'm just going to tell you a little bit of an anecdote. Before I came into work, I was talking to my dad. My dad said, I'm going to fill my tank, right? So he went to the petrol station. He said there were a lot of people doing the same. He was also saying that they have to fill this oil tanker that they have, which they use for heating. And he rang the place that he normally rings or gets the oil from. And he said that the guy there told him that there were 1,000 people waiting ahead of him. So clearly, there's a lot of people who are beginning to, I don't want to use the word panic, but certainly beginning to prepare for the possibility that prices are on the rise or that, they could really jump. But of course, my dad would remember the 1970s when there was, a huge jump in the prices. What would you recommend to the average person out there to do right now?
Not to panic, because what you're talking about is sort of the bank run mentality. You're worried about availability, and so you run to the pump to fill up before it runs out. There's been a lot made of what happened in the 1970s, and in point of fact, there really wasn't a need for rationing. Because rationing will typically occur in an open market through price. Now, price will go up, but that's already happening. Ironically, when you have that sort of bank run mentality and everybody goes to fill up quickly, that accelerates the flow of product through the refinery, out to the rack, and then ultimately the location where you're refilling a gasoline station or a heating oil station. That means that replacement barrel, the barrel at the margin, is actually impacting the price faster. And so you'll actually see a more rapid increase in price as consumers go out and do that more rapidly. And it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. So generally, the best thing to do is try to cool the temperature around what consumers are feeling, because that will eliminate the desire to go fill up your tank even though you don't need to fill it up, which will actually ease pressure on the supply chains for fuel delivery from the refinery all the way out to the petrol station, for example. It's not an easy thing to do, but historically what governments have done to try to kind of temper that is leverage strategic stocks. Say there's going to be a release, and that will ease some of the concern, if you will, that's out there, because it demonstrates from the government's perspective that there are mechanisms that can be leveraged to ease the pain. But certainly that panic mentality can actually exacerbate what we see in terms of the price at the pump and result in that, again, self-fulfilling prophecy of price rising very rapidly.
It's good advice there, Kenneth. Is this all another reason why countries should invest then more in renewable energy?
It is certainly a critical piece of that discussion, without a doubt. But it doesn't shield, renewable energy by itself doesn't shield customers from higher oil prices. You have to realize that oil is not just an input into making the fuel we consume. It's also an input to basically all of the materials that we immerse ourselves in every day. It's, as a matter of fact, we're talking right now through a virtual medium that the oil industry actually makes possible. You think about semiconductors and plastics and all the things that are sort of behind the screen that make this doable. Oil is a vital input there. So no matter what we do, we're not going to get away from that. But certainly the more diversified our energy mix is, the more resilient we are to oil price shocks, or quite frankly, energy price shocks, no matter where they come from. It doesn't have to be an oil price shock. It could be a disruption in a supply chain that is related to the electric power sector. And if we have resilience in that sector, because we have multiple sources of energy we can pull from to provide electrons to the grid, then we're shielded from that. So it really is a story of diversification, not a story of elimination.
Right. We're going to leave it there, Kenneth, but really great to get your insights and your analysis. Kenneth Medlock, Senior Director at the Centre for Energy Studies, Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Thanks so much, Kenneth.
Absolutely, Pablo. It was a pleasure.
All right, and let us know how those high gas prices are affecting you. Are you leaving your car at home? Have you gone to your gas station to fill up? Or are you just waiting to see what's going to happen? Tell us in the comments. Send us in your questions as always. Great to have you, as always, on DW. Take care.